The late afternoon sky over occupied Czechoslovakia on November 2nd, 1944, did not look like a place for miracles. It looked like a graveyard. At 3:47 p.m., the cockpit of Angel's playmate, a P-51 Mustang, belonging to the 354th Fighter Group, transformed from a high-tech sanctuary into a claustrophobic death trap. Lieutenant Bruce Carr watched the oil pressure needle plummet, bottoming out against the pin. A split second later, the elegant roar of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine dissolved into a horrifying symphony of destruction, metal tearing against metal, a violent, screeching protest of thousands of moving parts welding themselves together from friction. Just moments earlier, Carr had been leading his element on a relentless, low-altitude strafing run against a heavily defended German airfield. They had caught the Luftwaffe on the ground, but the German anti-aircraft crews were fast. A single jagged fragment from an 88mm flak shell had punched through the Mustang's nose cowling, slicing cleanly through the main oil line. Without lubrication, a Merlin engine has a lifespan of about 90 seconds. Once it seizes completely, the massive four-bladed propeller ceases to be a source of propulsion and becomes a 400-pound aerodynamic anchor. The P-51, celebrated as the finest fighter of the war, transforms instantly into a flying brick. Carr's options were instantly reduced to one. He unlatched the canopy, letting the freezing high-altitude slipstream blast into the cockpit. Grasping the control stick, he rolled the dying Mustang upside down, released his harness, and dropped out into the void. At 8,000 feet, the white silk canopy of his parachute blossomed against the gray European winter. As he drifted downward, Carr surveyed the landscape. It was a bleak, terrifying sight. He was deep in enemy territory, roughly 200 miles behind the shifting front line. He had no radio to call for rescue, no rations, no water, and no weapon save for a standard-issue .45 caliber pistol loaded with exactly 7 rounds. To make matters worse, Central Europe was locked in a bitter November cold snap. Nighttime temperatures were already plunging well below freezing. The cold, hard mathematics of the U.S. Army Air Force's statistical models painted a grim picture. An American pilot shot down deep within the Third Reich had about a 23% chance of successfully evading capture and navigating back to Allied lines. The remaining 77% either spent the duration of the conflict enduring the hardships of a prisoner of war camp like Stalag Luft III, or they filled a nameless, unmarked grave in a foreign forest. But Bruce Carr was a man who viewed statistics as mere suggestions. Over the next 4 days, he would not only defy the odds of survival, he would execute one of the most audacious acts of defiance in the history of aerial warfare. To understand how a 20-year-old pilot possessed the sheer audacity to survive what was coming, one has to look back to the fields of Union Springs, New York. Born in January 1924, Carr's childhood was thoroughly ordinary, save for a consuming obsession with the sky. In the summer of 1939, at just 15 years old, he convinced a local crop duster named Earl to let him take the controls of an old biplane. The timing was fateful. That very September, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, igniting World War II. While a teenage farm boy in upstate New York couldn't possibly foresee that he would one day be dogfighting over Berlin, an innate instinct told him that knowing how to master the air would soon be the most valuable skill a young man could possess. By the time he turned 16, Carr had logged more hours in the air than many military flight cadets. When he officially enlisted in the Army Air Forces in September 1942, fate intervened again. His assigned training instructor turned out to be Earl, the very same crop duster who had taught him to fly. Recognizing Carr's extraordinary innate talent and his 240 hours of pre-war flight time, Earl immediately recommended him for the accelerated fighter pilot track. By early 1944, Carr was stationed in England with the 9th Air Force. Strapped into the cockpit of the legendary P-51 Mustang, Carr immediately fell in love with the Mustang. It was a masterpiece of engineering, capable of escorting American B-17 bombers all the way to Berlin and back, flying at speeds over 430 miles per hour. The Luftwaffe pilots feared them, calling the long-nosed American fighters the bastards. Carr customized his aircraft, painting the words Angel's Playmate across the nose. He lived and breathed the machine, developing a hyper-aggressive flying style that quickly earned him both victories and reprimands. During his very first combat engagement in March 1944, Carr chased a German Messerschmitt Bf 109 through a daring, high-speed pursuit just feet above the treetops. The terrified German pilot panicked, pulled up to eject, but was too low. His parachute failed to open. Though Carr returned to base expecting applause, his commanding officer transferred him for recklessness, refusing to officially credit the kill because Carr hadn't technically fired the fatal burst, where the bureaucracy saw a dangerous liability. However, Carr simply saw the limits of what an airplane could do, and he was always willing to push past them. Now, on November 2nd, Carr hit the frozen Czechoslovakian dirt with a bone-jarring impact. His ankle twisted violently upon landing. It wasn't broken, but the severe sprain flared with agonizing pain the moment he tried to stand. Knowing the Germans would see his parachute and deploy tracking dogs within 20 minutes, Carr buried the silk canopy under a thick layer of dead leaves and forced himself to think. Standard survival doctrine dictated that a downed pilot should immediately head south or west, moving away from the area they had just attacked to reach the safety of Allied lines. Carr, however, understood that the German search parties would anticipate exactly that. If he wanted to live, he needed to do the absolute last thing the enemy expected. Limping heavily, using a broken branch as a crutch, Bruce Carr turned around and began walking north, directly toward the German airfield he had been strafing less than an hour ago. By the dawn of his second day in the wilderness, Carr's counterintuitive strategy was proving both brilliant and brutal. He stayed deep within the tree lines, avoiding every road, path, and clearing. The Germans were indeed searching for him, but their dragnet was expanding outward away from the airbase. At one point, Carr lay perfectly motionless in a freezing, mud-filled ditch for 2 agonizing hours, while a German patrol passed just a few hundred yards away. He didn't dare breathe heavily, watching the soldiers' boots move past his field of vision until the sound of their voices faded into the woods. Survival, however, is a matter of energy conversion. Carr was burning upwards of 4,000 calories a day, simply trying to keep his body temperature from dropping into fatal hypothermia. He had zero food. By day 3, his body began cannibalizing its own muscle tissue for energy. The sprained ankle was swollen to the size of grapefruit, throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache that made every step a testament to sheer willpower. Confronted by the very real prospect of starving to death in the frozen forest, Carr made a pragmatic, reluctant decision. He would surrender. He knew the unwritten code of the skies. The Luftwaffe generally treated captured Allied aviators with a degree of professional respect, vastly different from the brutal treatment meted out by the Gestapo or the SS. Pilots he knew who had been captured spoke of Stalag Luft 3 as a place of mind-numbing boredom, but one where you received 3 basic meals a day and Red Cross packages. It was a far better alternative than dying anonymously in the woods. On the late afternoon of the 4th day, Carr finally reached the northern perimeter of the German airfield. Crouching low in a dense thicket of pines, he looked out across the tarmac. He could see fuel tenders, staff cars, and mechanics moving between rows of Focke-Wulf Fw 190s and Messerschmitts. His plan was simple. He would rest in the tree line through the night to gather his remaining strength, and at first light, he would walk out onto the field with his hands raised. But as the twilight deepened into pitch black, Carr's attention was drawn to a reinforced earthen revetment just 80 yards from his hiding place. Inside sat a Focke-Wulf Fw 190, partially draped in camouflage netting. 2 German mechanics were illuminated by portable work lights, actively working on the aircraft. Carr watched them with the laser-focused intensity of a hawk. He watched as they topped off the fuel tanks to full capacity. He watched as they climbed into the cockpit and cranked the massive BMW 801 radial engine, its 1,700 horsepower roar echoing across the tarmac as they checked the magnetos and cycled the propeller through a comprehensive pre-flight inspection. Satisfied that the aircraft was in perfect mission-ready condition, the mechanics shut down the engine, pulled the canvas cover over the cockpit, extinguished their lights, and walked back toward the main hangars. The aircraft was left entirely unattended. There were no sentries, no guards, just a fully fueled, fully armed German fighter plane sitting 80 yards away from a starving American pilot. In that instant, Carr's plan to surrender evaporated into the cold night air. His mind, sharpened by hunger and adrenaline, began calculating a new reality. He had never flown a German aircraft. He didn't speak a single word of German. He had no manual, no instructor, and no idea how the internal systems operated. But as he looked at the silhouette of the fighter, he reminded himself of a fundamental truth. The physics of flight do not change based on a language stamped onto the instrument panel. Every fighter plane had a throttle to control power, a stick to manipulate the control surfaces, and rudder pedals to maintain yaw. He waited until 3 a.m., the hour when human alertness hits its absolute lowest point. The airfield was dead silent, save for the whistling of the wind. Taking a deep breath, Carr broke from the tree line. He covered the 80 yards of open, unprotected ground in an agonizing, low-crouch sprint, his injured ankle screaming in protest with every impact against the frozen earth. Reaching the Focke-Wulf, he was struck by its sheer, brutal size. Known to Allied pilots as Trouble, and to the Germans as the Wurger, the Butcher Bird, the Fw-190A-8 was a devastating machine. It weighed nearly a ton more than his Mustang, and carried an arsenal designed to shred heavy bombers. Two 13mm machine guns mounted in the cowl, and four 20mm cannons embedded in the wings. Carr scrambled up the wing route, slid back the heavy armored canopy, and dropped into the cockpit. The interior was suffocatingly tight, far smaller than the spacious cockpit of the P-51. His knees pressed uncomfortably against the lower edge of the main panel. When he looked down, he was confronted by a bewildering maze of unfamiliar instruments. Every single gauge, toggle, and lever was labeled in an incomprehensible, sharp Gothic German script. With roughly 4 hours remaining until sunrise, Carr went to work by touch in dim starlight. He used his fingers to trace the mechanical linkages and plumbing lines, relying on his deep understanding of aircraft anatomy to deduce the purpose of each control. He located the throttle quadrant on his left and the control stick on his right. He identified the primary flight instruments by their standard geometric positions. The airspeed indicator was typically top left, the altimeter top center. The ultimate hurdle was the starter system. In his American Mustang, starting the engine was a straightforward electrical process. In the Focke-Wulf, it was entirely different. Searching the right-hand console, his fingers brushed against a heavy, T-shaped metal handle. The German word stamped next to it looked vaguely like the word for starter. Carr took a gamble. He pushed the handle inward. Deep within the nose of the aircraft, a mechanical, high-pitched whine began to build. It was an inertia starter, spinning up a massive internal flywheel, like a children's gyroscope toy. He listened to the pitch rise, waiting 10 seconds, then 20, letting the flywheel accumulate maximum kinetic energy. Holding his breath, Carr pulled the T-handle hard toward his chest. The 14-cylinder BMW engine coughed violently, spitting a cloud of black exhaust into the darkness. Then, with a deafening apocalyptic roar, all 1,700 horses came alive. The entire airframe violently shuddered, the propeller dissolving into a blur. The noise was loud enough to wake every soul on the base. 5 months later, on April 2nd, 1945, Carr, now a first lieutenant, was leading a small flight of just 4 P-51 Mustangs on a routine reconnaissance mission near Schweinfurt, Germany. Cruising at 15,000 feet, Carr caught sight of a massive shadow moving above them, stacked in defensive layers from 18,000 all the way up to 25,000 feet, was an enormous formation of German fighters. Carr counted them rapidly. At least 60 enemy aircraft, a mixed force of the latest Bf-109 G-10s and Fw-190D-9s. Standard military doctrine under these circumstances was absolute and unambiguous. With a 15-1 numerical disadvantage and the enemy holding a high-altitude position, you disengage immediately, dive for safety, and report the formation's location to the heavy bomber escorts. Engaging was statistical suicide, but Bruce Carr had long since abandoned the rule books. He keyed his radio transmitter, uttered a single word to his 3 wingmen, engaging, and pulled his Mustang into a steep, aggressive climb directly into the belly of the German Dragon. The sheer audacity of the move was what saved them. The German pilots, flying in a relaxed formation, never anticipated that a mere 4 American fighters would choose to attack them. Capitalizing on the utter chaos, Carr tore into the back of the enemy formation. He caught a Bf-109 in his sights and fired a short burst from his 6.50 caliber machine guns. The German fighter disintegrated in midair. Without breaking stride, he maneuvered behind an Fw-190, sending it spiraling into the ground in flames. The massive German formation scattered in panic, completely unaware of how many Americans were actually attacking them. Moving like a wolf among a panicked flock of sheep, Carr picked off target after target. In a breathtaking display of aerial mastery lasting less than 3 minutes, Bruce Carr single-handedly shot down 5 German fighters, becoming one of the final aces in a day of a European war. His wingmen, inspired by his ferocity, claimed another 10. The final tally was an impossible 15 German aircraft destroyed to 0 American losses. For his legendary valor on that day, Carr was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second-highest military decoration. By the time the war concluded, he had flown 172 combat missions and amassed 15 confirmed aerial victories. He was just 21 years old. Unlike many of his peers who hurried back to civilian life, Carr chose to remain in the cockpit. He joined the Acrojets, the military's very first jet aerobatic demonstration team, mastering the new generation of F-80 shooting stars. When the Korean War erupted, he flew 57 high-stakes combat missions in F-86 Sabres, eventually rising to command the 336 Fighter Interceptor Squadron. A decade later, during the Vietnam War, a 44-year-old Colonel Carr was still on the front lines, flying an astonishing 286 close air support missions in the F-100 Super Sabre. Across 3 distinct wars and 3 entirely separate generations of aviation technology, Carr logged a staggering 515 total combat missions before finally retiring from active service in 1973. On April 25, 1998, Colonel Bruce Ward Carr passed away in St. Cloud, Florida, at the age of 74. He was laid to rest with full military honors in Section 64 of Arlington National Cemetery, surrounded by the heroes of the Republic. His marble headstone neatly tallies his rank, his wars, and a long list of medals: the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the Purple Heart. But a standard military headstone is far too small to hold the true weight of a legacy. It contains no mention of the cold Bohemian forest, the stolen Focke-Wulf, or the 62 for dogfight over Schweinfurt. 1 year prior to his death, in 1997, an aging Carr was invited to an air show at the Fantasy of Flight Museum in Florida. At 73 years old, he climbed into the cockpit of a beautifully restored P-51 Mustang. To the astonishment of the crowd below, the elderly veteran roared over the tarmac at 300 knots, just 50 feet off the deck, before pulling the historic fighter into a series of punishing loops, rolls, and high-G turns that would have tested a pilot 40 years his junior. When he finally shut down the engine and stepped onto the wing, a reporter in the crowd asked him what could possibly be going through his mind while performing such dangerous maneuvers at his advanced age. Carr simply shrugged, flashing the same confident grin he had worn in the cockpit of a stolen German fighter half a century earlier. "The same thing I was always thinking," Carr replied. "What's the airplane capable of? What am I capable of? Let's find out."